There we go. I think we're live. Welcome, Kestrel. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to just start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in conscious fashion?
I guess during college, I studied global studies and international journalism. And so I learned a lot about how a product or an idea or a person, how they move around the world and how they impact different things along the way and vice versa. And so after I graduated, I was kind of in this state where I just wanted to do something related to fair trade. That was something that made sense to me. But besides that, I had no idea. And so I kind of moved home to small town Wisconsin. It was like, what am I doing with my life? And my mom got a catalog from a company called Fair Indigo. And at the time, they were kind of new to the scene in the US being a fair trade fashion company. I looked at the catalog and I was like, this is my thing. So I need to figure out how to get into it. And I started researching and I found People Tree. I decided that I was going to intern with them however possible. So I literally emailed them every week and I was like, hey, can I just check in on that internship? Did you fill it yet? And when I finally did get the internship, I showed up and everyone thought I was the crazy American girl. They realized that I just really wanted to learn from them once I got there. And so I had the chance to work with Safia Mini and with their PR manager at the time, Anthony Waller. And that was just kind of my first introduction to the world. And from there, I just knew I had to keep being part of it. That was probably 11 or so years ago. At the time, it really wasn't a discussion in the US. It was really small as far as who was talking about it. So just in that amount of time to see how much it's transformed, to me, is impressive.
Now, if you guys don't know, I'm sure you guys know, but Kestrel's the host of the podcast Conscious Chatter, which is a super inspiring podcast. I learned so much. I love the stories that you share. And why did you decide to do a podcast instead of like a blog or something else like that?
Well, it started with a blog, and I was trying to share people's stories as far as the cool things they're doing and also what they were wearing. And I have a friend who has a company called Be Kind Vibes, and it's a hemp organic cotton t-shirt company. He's like, Kes, why don't you start a podcast? I can't find any podcasts that are talking about, this conversation. He had been searching sustainable fashion podcasts and wasn't finding it. And so I was like, well, that's a cool idea, but I have literally no idea how to make a podcast. It planted a seed and I kept thinking about it and wonder if I can pull this off. Started reading blogs about it, like learning a little bit more about podcasting. And then I just bought a microphone and started it. And as you can tell, if you listen to the first couple episodes, the sound quality is horrible because I did not know what I was doing yet. But from that point on, I've learned all of those details. I've just been really impressed by how many people are interested in the conversation and how audio seems to be a unique way to kind of capture attention. And maybe it's a little less intimidating to kind of join the conversation and learn as it works for you.
It's so different now that you can have these conversations across the world, which I personally think is really exciting.
Yeah,
And there's
I
people
love
from
that.
everywhere.
Why are we all trying to kind of recreate the wheel when it comes to this industry? Because there's people innovating in it all over the world. Like, why are we not collaborating more? And I think that we need to talk to each other as much as possible so we can build upon what everyone else is doing and not become competitive about it, but like keep growing the industry and keep innovating.
And do you think, like, in your opinion, that there is a lot of collaboration when it comes to, I guess, the sustainable, ethical fashion world? Or is it fairly competitive?
I think it's a combination. I mean, I think that it's becoming more collaborative. That seems to be a trend. When I've had people guests on the show, like from Timberland, and trying to think of another one from like Cradle to Cradle Institute, they're talking a lot about collaboration. And I guess for me, when you hear big brands, Eileen Fisher as well, like all of these teams are really talking about collaboration and they're trying to work together. And, Patagonia, even with their fair trade certified factories, they're trying to have it open source factories so other people can chime in and then join their factories instead of having to do all of the work that Patagonia did to set up those factories. I think there's a trend. I hope that it continues because I think fashion in general is not known to be very collaborative. So I know for young designers, I've had people come to me and say, I've been asking different people for ideas and if they can share kind of things that I'm trying to do as far as starting a brand. And I think they get both extremes. They get people that totally don't want to talk to them, and they get people that are open to share. So I think it's a combination, but I feel like it's definitely trending toward collaboration. And that's the only thing that makes sense to me, because if we're going to change things, like, it's going to change faster if we all work together.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm curious if your perception, I guess, of the industry has changed since you've been doing the podcast, or even since you started your blog.
I guess the industry is constantly changing. So my perception of it is definitely also changing. The industry is changing really fast right now. And, there's a trend toward jumping into this conversation now. All the big brands have some sort of CSR team. If they don't, then they're really far behind. But then I guess it's getting more detail oriented. So it used to be kind of like really big picture when you talk about this industry. And now we're able to like get down and deeper into all these other layers and talk about what that means. And it's like no one has the answers because this hasn't been really addressed in the past. Fashion started as something simple, and then it evolved into this massive mess of an industry which is, so disconnected, that has so many extremely long supply chains. So big companies can't track their own supply chain. So I think that it's changed so much that it's kind of hard to know how my perception has changed. But I guess right now I do feel that that we're in a good place, and there's more and more people coming to the table. But then it's at the same time, as a consumer, it can be more complicated and almost like more overwhelming, because there are all these brands coming out being like, I'm an eco fashion brand, or I'm, and then as a consumer, then you have to know all these questions to ask, and everyone's not as much of an obsessed person like me about the industry, and they shouldn't have to be. So I think it gets complicated for consumers.
Yeah, for sure. I know that like a huge question I get all the time is like, how do I tell if a brand is greenwashing?
It's complicated, but the more you have a personal connection to a brand, I think the better off you are, because you're learning directly from them. I find that if I email a brand about a question and I don't hear anything back, then it's kind of like, all right, well, maybe that's a red flag for me. I send Instagram messages to people all the time, like brands, like, can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about that? That open transparency says a lot for me. So if a brand responds and is happy to talk about it, I think that's huge. As far as other tips, I would say ask your friends too, because your friends might have a personal connection to a brand. You can read the websites and you can read their, about and their environmental policy or their human right policy, those pages on their sites. But that again can get really overwhelming. Mm-hmm. You can watch for some labels. Labeling is also really complicated, but you can watch for like Fair Trade USA is a great label that's now available on clothes. You can watch for organic cotton, but then there's all these other questions. It's not like there's one thing. So I think also as shoppers, it's helpful to think about, what are the most important elements for you? What are you looking for? What really means something to you? And also not to think that you have to always check every single box, because mm-hmm. that's realistically, that's not necessarily even possible, because if a brand's creating a product, they're creating some sort of an impact.
So something that I love about your podcast is that you focus on telling positive stories. And I think that that is really important when it comes to conversations around conscious fashion. And I'm curious if that was like a conscious decision on your part, or if you're just a really positive person and that was just kind of naturally how it went.
I mean, I don't think it was necessarily intentional in the beginning. What I really wanted to set out to do was kind of break down different parts of the industry in an easy to understand way. So I tried to have really overarching topics and kind of start big. So we talked about water, we talked about cotton, and talking about like big topics, but bringing in an expert. And I guess naturally I'm drawn to the experts that are doing something really powerful and positive. I have been an optimist as far as this industry for years now, thinking that it's going to get better and, feeling like there are changes on the horizon. And so I think it's kind of a combo. The True Cost, the documentary, which a lot of people that have come into this conversation saw that and were like, whoa, I want to know more. I had no idea. Or, this just brought a lot of things to the forefront that I want to learn more about. And Andrew Morgan did a great job telling the story about how the fashion industry is a mess. But then after that, sometimes you can feel a bit defeated and kind of like, now what do I do? And so I feel like the positive stories are the next step in kind of helping you keep moving and not feel totally paralyzed.
What's your opinion on storytelling and the idea of like using stories as a way to engage people in these conversations?
Mm-hmm. It sounds so cliche because, it's like 2 or 3 years ago was the year of the story, and it's become so much more just, it's another trend. Everyone's like, oh, well, it's storytelling and I'm a storyteller. But, you look back at oral history, everything is connected to story. Like our lives are connected to story. And so the more we can find ways to connect with people through telling stories, like the more we can push this conversation further. I like to hear stories from other people. So I like to frame up like a general idea of a story, but then let other people tell their story about it, because I think really hearing personal stories helps people understand. There's an organization called Remake, and they're out of San Francisco, and they do a really good job of helping to tell stories about the women who make our clothes, because the number of women that make our clothes around the world is massive. And so they do a really good job of connecting you to actual people. And you can meet this woman and learn about her story. And, it's kind of about breaking down those barriers, not just thinking about the garment workers or just thinking about the people in the supply chain, but thinking about actual humans. Like, this is a woman and this is her life and she has these struggles, and you can relate to her in these ways. There's human experiences that can really connect us. When I talk about it with friends, I feel like talking about what I'm wearing is the easiest way to bring it up, because in the beginning of this journey, I was like the, over the top extreme person that was just so upset about it. And I would be kind of like negative, and I'm like, don't you care? How do you not care? And that gets us nowhere. So I learned very quickly that was a bad approach. But now it's easiest for me to not push it on people. It's almost like if it comes up naturally, great. But I think it's important to not shut people out. And the more that we like make it an inclusive conversation where people feel welcomed into it, the better everyone's going to be.
So I would love to know if you have any brands that you think are doing a really good job in terms of how they are telling their own stories. And it kind of ties in with a question that we have in the chat from T-shirts and Jeans, who asks, who are some of your favorite to follow people or brands on Instagram?
I mean, I love what you're doing. It's really fun to follow you. There's another YouTuber called Ali Cherry, who I've mentioned before. There's a woman named Dominique Drakeford, and she has a really cool website called Melanin ASS, like Melanin in Sustainable Style. So she's trying to bring women of color into the conversation further, because so often this is like very white woman conversation. I guess for me too, I like to find like the little small brands where I suddenly discover them and I'm like, wow, this is really cool. So I do a lot of just scrolling through Instagram, finding a hashtag and seeing kind of where it leads me. There's some cool platforms that have been popping up, like A Company has a lot of cool brands and they're doing really cool photo shoots. Because for me too, I think we need to get better as far as the images go, as far as the way that the styling is done, as far as like what it looks like to the consumer. And it's definitely gotten far better, but I think that we still need to keep working on that, because it needs to compete on a fashion level first and then have this really great story behind it.
And I'm curious, like from your perspective and like where you live in the US and stuff, like do you think there is a shift overall in terms of what people are thinking, or people starting to think about things, or there's still a long, long way to go?
I think we still live in a small bubble compared to like the larger population. And it's a privilege bubble. The fact that we can even think about this and talk about it is privilege. But I think it's changing. I absolutely think it's changing, and I think it's getting to a better place. If you just think about media and the conversations that were happening around this industry, like 5-6 years ago, there was hardly anything out there. You could go and you could get content from Ecoterre, like specific websites that wrote about sustainable fashion. But there weren't articles in the Huffington Post and in the New York Times. Like the big guys weren't necessarily talking about it on a regular basis. And you see it being addressed. For me, that's one really good start, because I think what the media says is a form of education to, the larger population. And so that's a good step. And I also think that there's going to be a gradual progression between like what you want to do versus what you actually do. It's not like, oh, cool, I want to support better brands. Instantly, you're doing that. I mean, there's a learning curve, and it takes time to kind of like reformat the systems that you have and the way that you act and the way you interact with shopping. And it's not going to happen overnight. So I think we also have to be patient, which is definitely not my strong quality, but I always am like, you have to remember that, because it's changing human behavior is not something that happens really fast.
Do you think that when it comes to, I guess, expressing your style, that it's more difficult if you're trying to shop consciously, or do you find that you actually find more unique and interesting pieces?
I personally think you find more unique and interesting pieces. And also, someone I had on the podcast, Timo Rissanen, who's a zero waste designer and professor, he brought up this quote and reminded me of it. And he said, creativity comes with constraints. And I think that's so true. And for me, like having less options means I have to get more innovative. And so let's say I only have 5 dresses that are like my favorite dresses and they're in my closet. I only have those options to work with. So I'm going to take those and like layer things with them, and, different accessories, different shoes. Like, I guess for me, having less options actually has helped me be more creative. I don't feel like I have any problem when it comes to expressing myself. I feel like going to thrift stores, going to estate sales, like there's so many opportunities to find these unique gems. And for me, I've never been a fan of looking like everyone else. I was always the weirdo kid in school that had crazy outfits on, and people are like, where did you come from? Like in a small town in the Midwest. But it's just, I love it. It's kind of like my form of expression. It's my form of art, is like putting together a composition of an outfit. And I love it. And I think it's also key if you're thinking about, shifting your wardrobe or, becoming more conscious about what you're buying, you don't have to do it all at the same time. Like if you have a closet already, if you're thinking about this, so you can use those things and just like gradually shift over. I don't think it's ever necessarily a good idea to just like dump everything and start fresh.
In your experience with all these brands doing really interesting and unique things, how does a customer find out what a brand is doing, or even find these brands? Because I think it can be so hard when you just see a name or you just see a website to really actually get that information and get that story behind it. So for someone that's just looking online, like how can they find that out?
I think maybe a good starting point is offline. For me, at least, it's nice to connect with who's local in the community doing positive things. So like, for instance, someone mentioned these earrings. They're by a brand called House Goods. And I live in San Diego, and the woman is a mom. She does this as like her source of income and has built this brand. And she's at a lot of the art shows and like the maker markets. And so I met her that way. I think finding out what's going on locally, like is there a boutique that has local brands in it? Or is there a maker's market or even farmers markets? A lot of times you can meet people doing cool things. So I think it's almost like easier to start that way. And then you're immediately getting a personal connection, which to me is the most rewarding, because then you're wearing it and you're like, oh yeah, my friend made this. And it just has something more connected about it, I guess. If from there you want to go online and search, I think a good way is to look at some of the great bloggers like Sustainably Chic, like Natalie. She's someone to look to because she has an amalgamation of tons of brands. And so that's a good place to start. And then there's kind of like platforms that are bringing in multiple brands. And if you find the platform that has the price point that works for you or kind of that style that works for you, that's another good way. You can listen to the podcast. There's a lot of brands that I feature and, people like you. I think it's like you just have to find the people that speak your language and have a similar style or something that kind of connects with you and follow them. And again, ask questions. If you're trying to find something, anytime people can reach out to me, I'm happy to answer questions. I get a lot of people that are like, I'm looking for shoes for a wedding. Where can I go? Or, whatever it might be. And I think the more we can help each other out, the easier this is. I used to know every single brand that existed out there that had some sort of social or environmental angle. Like not even like through and throughout, like anything connected to that. I knew all of them. But now I can't keep up. Like there's brands that launch all the time. And I think that's really incredible. And so the fact that I can constantly learn from other people because they have access to a different network, that's where it gets really fun. And you start realizing that this is changing and, people are stepping up and building things that have more to say than just like, here's another fashion brand.
Are there any guests that you've had that you've just been super inspired by and that you think are doing really amazing things?
So Mara Hoffman, I think her story is really powerful because she was a brand that grew as a traditional fashion brand has in the past and still does. And she didn't really know about like what was going on behind the scenes. She kind of just did what were the next steps. And then when she realized what was going on and that she was making a negative impact, she like broke down and was like, we have to change everything. And I think a lot of brands, when they realize that, they just kind of sweep it under the table and don't want to deal with it. And so I find that very admirable when a larger brand is like, we have to address this and I'm going to talk about it and I'm going to say, I don't have it figured out and I have to learn. And I think as a consumer, as a shopper, for me to hear that, I'm like, wow, I respect you so much more because you're telling me the truth right now. And I think more and more, we all want to know the truth. We don't want to be like, I just heard a story on NPR the other day about brands and how we used to be like so connected to brands, but we're losing that because we don't trust them. Mm-hmm. And we have to find ways to trust the brands or the people we buy from in all areas of life, not just clothes. Yomi Abiola is someone who is doing very cool things when it comes to fashion. And she had an organization called Stand Up for Fashion and talking about inclusivity in the fashion industry. And I loved that chat because it was like a humbling one for me where I had to just listen and learn. And let's see, I loved chatting with Andrew Morgan because he's just such a cool guy. And he just like is so, again, honest when he communicates. And it really comes through. And I think audio, it comes through so much because you can sense someone's voice, how much they're telling you the truth. You can kind of feel someone's approach through audio, and there's something really cool about that.
It makes me feel so good when a brand is saying, this is what we're doing, but we're not perfect and we really want to improve this and we're working on this. And like that kind of approach really gives me a lot of confidence in a brand than a brand that kind of portrays this image of them being totally perfect and doing everything right.
One of my recent podcasts is with a woman from Swedish Stockings. They make nylons and tights from recycled nylon, pre-consumer textile waste. And for me to hear her say, she's like, this isn't the best solution. She's like, we want to be able to recycle nylon and like from people's past tights or nylons that they had, but we can't do that yet because we can't separate the spandex from the nylon because that technology hasn't been developed. But she's like, at least we're doing this. And they're collecting people's old tights and they figured out a unique way to kind of like downcycle it. And they use it in like grease traps for restaurants. like repurposed to be utilized in such a random and, like she said, not sexy way, but they're using it and it's not going to landfill. And so I think also it's about being able to think, okay, well, this is maybe not the best solution right now, but this is the better solution. And so it's better to do that than do nothing.
And Allie Irving says, is the ethical community more critical of each other not coming up to scratch with their efforts?
I think that's a great question. And I think I've read from a lot of friends who are bloggers that is a challenge, because when you put something out there, it's an open space for people to critique it. And the thing is I don't think that gets us anywhere. I think having constructive conversations and helping each other learn and grow is positive, but just pushing people down isn't getting us anywhere. And I think there's elements of that in this conversation, but I try to ignore it as much as possible, in all honesty, because I would rather like celebrate the good things. I think we all have to be critical of what's going on around us and try to do it constructively if we find things that don't reflect our values. But then it goes back to, this is an individual experience. Like what you wear and what you buy is very personal. And so, what I think is important to me might not be the most important for you. And I think we all have to kind of remember that also when we're being critical of what's happening around us. If you're feeling like what someone is doing doesn't align with your values, ask a question, about it. I don't think the best way to approach anything is, you're doing this wrong and this is the better option. I think you learn a lot by asking questions. That's why I love having a podcast, because I don't always have the answers. There's a million things that I need to learn about this industry, but you can ask a question and then you might learn something that the other person was actually thinking about that you didn't realize. I think assuming that someone else is wrong is never like the best first approach.
And Kestrel, okay, so I know you always end your podcasts by asking your guest what we can do as people, and I would love to turn the question on to you. So what can we do?
This is the simple thing that I always say, but I think we can all keep asking questions and we can support people in the space. And we can do that by just simple acts. Like, let's say you find a brand that's doing something super cool. You can post about it on Instagram or Facebook, on social media. Those little acts actually can become really powerful. And I think it's about supporting people. And also, like, we don't tell people in the space that they're doing cool things enough. So I've been trying to be better at that. If I see a YouTuber that's really awesome, or a blogger or a writer, I can say, hey, you're doing something awesome, or I love that post. I think we need to support each other more and kind of push the conversation forward in a positive way.
So again, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody joining us. If you guys haven't checked out Conscious Chatter, be sure, I'll link it down below. Be sure to listen to it. It's amazing. All right, guys. Thank you, Kestrel.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.